There he is, the action figure they wind up every morning and stand by the gate. The voice carried across the whole forecourt, big and bright and built for a microphone, and every head on the cobbles turned toward it. I was 4 paces from Aldous Wren on the line that morning, close enough to see the chinstrap of his bearskin and the medals he never spoke about, and I knew before I looked that the loud man would walk straight at him. The loud ones always did. They picked the stillest man on the line because stillness to them looks like permission. The loud man had a camera crew. That was the new part. I am Corwin Tate, and I have stood the King's line at the Hartmore forecourt for 11 years, long enough to learn that the post teaches you to read a crowd the way a farmer reads a sky. You feel the weather of it before the first drop. And the weather that morning, the moment the television van rolled its cables across our cobbles and a man in an expensive imitation of a soldier's coat stepped out grinning, was a storm dressed up as a sunny day. His name was Brock Vane. I didn't know it yet, but the banner taped to the side of the van told me, in letters a yard high, Brock Vane, survive anything. Underneath, smaller, as seen on 6 continents, he had the look of a man who had spent more on his teeth than I had on my house. Tanned, broad, a 3-day beard groomed to within an inch of its life, a knife the size of a forearm strapped to a thigh that had clearly never been cold. He carried himself like the most dangerous man in any room he entered, and the terrible thing, the thing I want you to understand from the start, is that a great many people in that crowd believed it. "We're rolling," said a woman with a clipboard, and Vane's grin sharpened into something for sale. He planted himself a body's length from Aldous, turned his good side to the lens and spread his arms to take in the whole immaculate line of us. "Folks, you want to talk about soft? Look at this." He gestured at Aldous like a man showing off a sofa. "This is what we call a soldier now, stands in a costume, gets handed a hot meal, sleeps in a stone palace with the heating on, never been cold a day in his life, never been hungry, never had to make the hard call when the weather turns and the daylight's running out." He leaned in toward Aldous' unmoving face, close enough that I saw the camera assistant wince. "I've eaten beetles to stay alive, my friend. What have you eaten? The catering tent." The crowd laughed, some of them, the ones with phones already up. Aldous Wren did not move. He did not move the way the cliff does not move when the tide slaps it. His eyes held the middle distance over Vane's shoulder, fixed on a point past the gilded railings where the gate met the morning, and his white-gloved hands stayed exactly where the drill had set them. A muscle in my own jaw tightened, and I let it. That is the cost of the line. You carry the heat the other man is forbidden to show. Vane mistook the stillness for the thing it always looks like to men like him, weakness wearing a brave face. "See, that's the thing," he said, turning back to his lens, warming up now, feeding off the laughter. "Discipline's easy when nothing's at stake. Anybody can stand still in a nice safe square with a fence around them and a cafe across the road. I'd love, genuinely, I would love," he put a hand on his own chest, sincerity for the camera, "to drop one of these polished gentlemen onto a real mountain. No heating, no catering, no fence. 40 hours, the temperature falling through the floor, and see how the discipline holds up when the discipline is the only thing between you and the dark." He grinned again. "I'll tell you how it holds up. It doesn't. Pretty men in tall hats fold the second the world gets unkind. I have heard the guard mocked 100 ways in 11 years. Tourists flick their fingers in our faces. Drunks bellow. Children dare each other to make us laugh, and that one I forgive entirely. But there was something in Vane's particular contempt that landed harder than the rest, and it took me a moment, standing there with my own face locked, to understand why. It was the word soft. He kept coming back to it. Soft, pampered, never been cold. He was so certain that the men inside these uniforms had never met the kind of cold that takes fingers, never made a decision with lives hanging off it, that he could say it to a camera and sell it to 6 continents. And I happened to know exactly how wrong he was about the specific man he had chosen. But the line does not let you speak. So I held it and I watched, and I waited for the morning to do what mornings on this forecourt eventually do: turn. Vane was just getting started. He liked an audience, and the forecourt had given him one. The tourists had drifted in close, a loose half-circle of raised phones and curious faces, and the more they watched, the bigger he got. He paced. He held up his enormous knife and talked about a ravine in some country he pronounced like a trophy. He told a story about 3 days without water that I am fairly sure he had told 1,000 times, because it came out smooth as a coin worn down by handling. Then he came back to Aldous, because the still man was the best prop he had. "You know what gets me," he said, dropping his voice to a confidential rumble the microphone caught perfectly. "It's the medals. Look at the medals on this one." He peered at Aldous's chest with theatrical wonder. "What's a man like this get a medal for? Standing. Is there a medal for standing? Because out where I work you don't get a ribbon. You get to live or you don't. That's the only medal that counts." He reached out, and this is the moment the whole crowd leaned in, because you do not touch the guard. Everyone knows you do not touch the guard, and he flicked one of the medals with a fingernail. A small, contemptuous tick of sound, metal on metal. Aldous did not move, but I saw it. I had stood beside the man for years, and I saw the thing no tourist could have seen. A stillness inside the stillness, a deeper settling, the way a man goes quiet not because he is empty but because he has just decided something and is now simply waiting for the time to be right. The medal he had flicked, I knew that medal. I knew what it was given for, and I knew that not one person in that laughing, filming crowd had the first idea, and I knew that the man who had just flicked it with his fingernail was about to learn, on his own camera, on 6 continents, exactly what kind of cold the soft man in the tall hat had walked out of alive. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he was filming a comedy. What he was actually filming, though none of us could see the shape of it yet, was the worst professional morning of Brock Vane's life, and it had already begun. The woman with the clipboard, his producer, I would learn. A sharp-faced woman named Della Mott, who watched everything through a viewfinder even when there wasn't one in her hands, stepped in close to Vane between takes and murmured something. Whatever it was, it pleased him. He clapped his hands once loud and turned to the crowd like a ringmaster. "All right," he announced. "I've got an idea. I love this. Watch this." He moved back into Aldous's space, but this time he addressed the line itself, all of us, while keeping his face angled to the lens. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm a generous man. I'm going to give one of these gentlemen a chance to prove me wrong. Live, on camera." He spread his hands. "We've got a whole segment to fill, and I cannot think of better television than a real survival man taking a pampered palace ornament and showing him, kindly, exactly how far his discipline gets him the moment he steps off the cobbles." I felt the cold settle in my own stomach then, because I understood what he was angling at, and I understood that there was nothing any of us on the line could do to stop it. We could not speak. We could not break formation. We could not tell this grinning man that he had picked, out of the whole regiment, out of the whole long history of the line, possibly the single worst person to call soft on a mountain. A junior officer would have to intervene, and junior officers, I had learned over 11 years, do not always arrive in time. But the strange thing, and I have turned this over many times since, is that Aldous Wren's face in that moment changed by exactly nothing, and yet I would have sworn on the gate itself that something in him welcomed it. Not the mockery. He had no use for the mockery. But the offer of a mountain, even a televised pretend one, the way it landed in a man who had spent the best and worst years of his life on real ones. I think a door opened somewhere behind that still face, and a cold wind he knew very well blew through it. Vane did not see any of that. He saw a statue and a camera and a number, the number being the audience he imagined gasping at home. "Della," he called, "we set this morning. Tell me we're set." "We're set," Della said. "Permissions came through last night." The palace cleared a controlled segment. "There's a liaison." She nodded toward the colonnade, where a man in a gray suit stood with his hands folded, watching us with the particular stillness of someone whose job is to make sure nothing goes wrong, and who has already concluded that something will. That detail mattered more than I knew. The palace had cleared this. Someone, somewhere up the chain, had read Brock Vane's request, celebrity survivalist, light human interest segment, the guard as gentle good sport, and had signed it. And in signing it had set in motion a thing none of them intended, because the request had crossed the right desk. And the man at that desk had read the name of the guardsman they proposed to feature, and had said yes, and had said nothing else, and had quietly arranged to be free that morning to come and watch. I did not know that yet. None of us on the line did. We only knew that a television crew had a permission slip and a smile, and that the man they meant to humiliate was standing 4 paces from me with a flicked medal still ringing in the air. "Here's the segment," Vane told the crowd, pacing again, hungry, alive. "Simple, honest. We take this gentleman, you sir, the one with the medals, you'll do nicely, and we run him through 3 little tests. Survival basics, things a man like me does in my sleep. Things that separate the people who'd live from the people who'd be a frozen statistic by the second night." He ticked them off on thick fingers. "Read the weather, make the call, bring your people home. That's the whole game out there, that's all of it. 3 things this man has never once had to do in his cosseted life." He smiled at Aldous, almost fond now, the fondness of a cat. "And we'll do it gentle, we'll do it kind. I just want the good people watching to see, with their own eyes, the difference between a soldier and a souvenir." The crowd was eating it, phones everywhere. I heard a man behind me say, half laughing, "He's not wrong though, is he?" They just stand there. And I wanted, with an intensity that surprised me even after all these years, to turn around and tell that man exactly what the still soldier in front of him had once done in weather that would have killed every person in that forecourt inside an hour. I held my tongue. The tongue is the first thing the line teaches you to hold, and the last thing you ever fully master. Delamotte was setting up a low table now, her crew unfolding a backdrop, a printed photograph of a snow-blasted ridgeline, all drama and menace, the kind of mountain that exists to make a man in a studio look brave. They were going to do this right here, on the cobbles, with the gate behind them and the real palace as a stage. A pantomime mountain in front of the genuine article. It was while they fussed with the backdrop that the first crack appeared in Brock Vane's perfect morning, and it came from the smallest possible source. A girl, I'd put her at 9 or 10, in a red coat, her hands swallowed in her grandmother's, had been standing at the rope the whole time, watching not Vane but Aldous, the way the young sometimes lock onto the still figure and won't be moved. And in the lull while the crew worked, her clear voice carried across the cobbles, pitched to her grandmother but loud in the way children are loud when they think they're whispering. "Gran, that's the man from the picture. In Daddy's book, that's him." I saw the grandmother go very still. I saw her bend and ask the girl something low, and I saw the girl nod hard, certain the way only a child can be certain. And I saw the grandmother straighten and look at Aldous Wren's face, really look, and then lift one hand to her own mouth. She knew. Whatever the girl had recognized from her father's book, the grandmother had just confirmed it with her own eyes, and what crossed her face was not the amusement Vane was selling to the rest of the crowd. It was something closer to reverence. The kind of look you give a man when you have just realized that the joke being made at his expense is the cruelest joke you have ever stood and watched. Vane noticed none of it. He was checking his hair in the reflection of a camera lens. "We're rolling in 30, Della called. And the grandmother in the crowd took her granddaughter's hand and began, very quietly, to push forward through the press of bodies toward the rope. Not to get a better view of the show, I understood a moment too late, but to get close enough to stop it. She wasn't going to make it in time. The crew was already counting down, but she was moving, and the man in the gray suit by the colonnade had seen her move and had turned his head to follow her, And a third thing was happening now that I could feel but not yet name: the morning gathering itself, the weather turning, the still center of the forecourt beginning at last to tilt. 10 seconds, Della said. Brock Vane squared his shoulders, found his grin, and stepped into the light to begin the worst mistake of his career. Welcome back, he told the lens, warm as a fireplace. Now I do this all over the world. I take ordinary people and I show them what they're really made of. But today's special. Today I've got a volunteer who has spent his whole life being told he's the toughest, most disciplined kind of man there is. He gestured grandly at Aldous. And I want to find out gently, respectfully, whether all that polish goes more than skin deep. Sir, you don't have to say a word. You're not allowed to, are you? Perfect, that suits me fine. I'll do the talking, you just try to keep up. A junior officer had appeared at the edge of the colonnade, Lieutenant Hask, young, conscientious, plainly uncertain whether a permitted segment was his to interrupt. He hovered. The palace had cleared this. The gray-suit liaison gave him a small, level shake of the head. Wait, and Hask, to his credit and to my growing dread, waited. So there was no rescue coming, which meant the only man who could turn this morning was the one forbidden to move or speak. First test, Vane announced, and produced from his table a printed weather chart, the kind that looks impressive and means very little, all swirling arrows and pressure lines. He held it up beside Aldous' face for the camera. Read the weather. Out there, this is everything. The mountain doesn't care how brave you are, it cares whether you saw the front coming. So, he tapped the chart, condescending, a teacher with a slow pupil. I'll make it easy. Big storm system, right here moving in. Question is, do you push for the summit or do you turn your people around? Now obviously you can't answer, but I'll bet you anything, a man who's never been off a flat square in his life, your instinct would be to push, because you don't know what that sky can do to you. Am I right? He wasn't asking, he was performing the answer he wanted, and he turned to milk the crowd's laugh. And that was the moment the real weather, the actual sky over the actual forecourt, did the thing that I have come to think of as the morning's first verdict. The light changed, not dramatically. A cloud, a long gray one that had been sitting low over the eastern roofs since before the crew arrived, slid the last of the way across the sun, and the temperature on the cobbles dropped in the space of a breath, and a wind came up off the river that I felt go straight through the wool of my own tunic. Tourists pulled their coats. A paper cup skittered across the stones. And I watched Aldous Wren's eyes, which had not moved from the middle distance through all of it, lift, by perhaps 2 degrees, to the eastern sky. Just for an instant, the smallest tilt of attention. A man reading a thing he had read 10,000 times in places where reading it wrong was fatal. Brock Vane, his back to that sky, felt the cold on his neck and misread it entirely. Ooh, chilly, he said to the camera, rubbing his arms. See, this is nothing. This is a spring breeze. You want to talk about cold. There's weather coming in. The gray-suit liaison said it, quiet but it carried. Off the east, within the hour, you'll want to wrap your outdoor segment. Vane's grin flickered just once. He hated being told. We're fine, he said. We've got a permit till noon. You have a permit, the liaison agreed mildly. You don't have the sky. And he looked, as he said it, not at Vane and not at the chart, but at Aldous. And something passed between the two men that I could not read but could feel, the way you feel 2 old soldiers recognize each other across a room full of civilians. I filed that away. The liaison knew Aldous. The liaison had read the East the same instant Aldous had. And the liaison was not, I began to suspect, merely a liaison. Vane pressed on because the camera was rolling, and a man like Vane would rather be wrong on television than silent on it. Second test, he said, recovering his swagger. Make the call. He swept the printed mountain backdrop with his arm. This is the one that separates the men from the ornaments. You're up high, lights going. One of your party's hurt, twisted ankle, can't walk fast. You've got, say, 4 hours of daylight and a 6-hour descent. He leaned into Aldous. What do you do? And I'll tell you what a soft man does. A soft man panics. A soft man either leaves the weak one behind to save himself, or he gets sentimental, refuses to leave anybody, and kills the whole party trying to be a hero. There's no good answer. That's the point. That's why men like me are rare and men like you are, well, he smiled, decorative. The crowd laughed again, but it was thinner now. The cold had taken some of them, and the grandmother in the red-coated girl's grip had reached the rope and was standing against it with her hand pressed flat to her chest, and I saw her lips move, and though I could not hear it, I would have put my pension on the word. No. Aldous Wren did not panic, and he did not get sentimental, because Aldous Wren was not playing Brock Vane's game at all. He stood his post. But I, who had stood beside him for 11 years, watched his weight settle a half-inch differently into his heels, the way a man sets himself before a long carry, and I understood that somewhere behind his eyes he was answering Vane's stupid question with the correct answer. The real one, the one the cameras would never get because the line would never let him give it, and the correct answer was nothing like what Vane had described. The correct answer, I happened to know, was the one Aldous had actually given once on a real mountain, in a real dark, with real people who would have died without it. You do not leave the weak one. You do not kill the party being a hero. You do the third thing, the hard, patient, disciplined thing that men like Vane have never had to do because men like Vane have never been responsible for anyone but themselves. You build the shelter. You hold them through the night. You bring them down at first light, slow, together, all of them breathing. It takes the one thing Vane was certain the guard didn't have. It takes the discipline to stand still in the dark and not give in to the wind. Which was, of course, the very thing Aldous Wren did better than any man I have ever known. Third test, Vane was saying, but the wind was rising now, snatching at the printed mountain behind him, and Della Motte was glancing at the eastern sky with the first real worry I'd seen on her sharp face, and the gray-suit liaison had taken one step out from the colonnade, and the grandmother at the rope had finally caught a steward's sleeve and was saying something urgent into his ear. And that was when the first fat drop of rain hit the cobbles, and the morning Brock Vane thought he was directing took the script clean out of his hands. It came the way real weather always comes when the sky has been warning you and you've chosen not to listen, not as a gentle building, but all at once, a wall. The gray cloud broke open. The wind that had been pushing off the river turned into something with teeth, and it took Della Motte's printed mountain backdrop and folded it like paper and sent the whole rig of poles and fabric tumbling sideways across the forecourt. Tourists scattered, shrieking and laughing the nervous way crowds do. A light stand went over with a crash of glass. Vane shouted something about getting the camera under cover, his warm television voice cracking into the higher register of a man who has lost control of his own segment. And in the middle of all of it, the wind, the rain coming sideways now, the crowd surging for the colonnade, I heard the grandmother scream. Not the word she'd been mouthing, a name, Posy, Posy. The little girl in the red coat. In the scramble, the grandmother's hand had been torn loose from hers, and the child had been carried 3 steps in the wrong direction by the press of fleeing bodies. And now, I saw it. We all should have seen it, but only one of us moved. The falling lighting rig that had crashed down was not done falling. The whole steel scaffold of it, half its guy lines snapped by the gust, was leaning, groaning, and the child had stumbled to the cobbles directly beneath the slow, sickening tilt of it, and the grandmother could not reach her through the crowd, and Brock Vane, survival man, 6 continents, eaten beetles to stay alive. Brock Vane was 12 feet away with a clear path, and he froze. I will say it plainly because it is the truth and the camera caught it. The man who had spent the morning calling the guard soft stood rooted to the cobbles with both hands over his head and did not move toward the child. Not out of cruelty. Out of the oldest thing there is. His body, faced for the first time all morning with a real call to make in a real falling dark, made the soft choice. The choice he'd spent the morning swearing the guard would make, and he flinched. Aldous Wren broke the line. He did it the way he did everything, without panic, without a wasted motion, with a speed that had nothing of haste in it and everything of training. One instant he was the statue, eyes forward, 11 years of drill holding him to the cobbles. The next he was simply moving, and the rifle was set down, not dropped, even then, even there. And the bearskin came off in one motion because it would slow him, and he crossed the forecourt through the sideways rain faster than Vane had ever moved in his cosseted life. He reached the child a half-second before the rig came down. I have tried many times to describe what I saw next, and I always fall short, because what he did was not dramatic in the way television wants drama. He did not catch the falling steel like a man in a film. No one can. What he did was read it, the same read he'd made of the sky an hour before, the same read he'd made on a real mountain in a real dark. And he saw in that half-second which way the scaffold would fall and where the gap would be. And he scooped the girl off the cobbles and pivoted his whole body and put himself between the steel and the child, and took them both into the one pocket of safety the falling rig left. Rolling his shoulder to the impact, so the worst of it struck the heavy fabric and the bent pole, and not the small body he'd wrapped in both arms. The rig came down with a sound like a dropped church bell. The rain hammered it. And out of the tangle, after a moment that stopped my heart entirely, Aldous Wren rose to one knee with the girl held against his chest, her red coat soaked, her face buried in his shoulder, both of them breathing alive, while the storm screamed around them and 100 phones, the ones that hadn't run, caught every second of it. The grandmother reached them. He passed the child up into her arms with a gentleness that I had only ever seen in him once before, years ago, on a different morning, and the grandmother clutched the girl and looked at the kneeling guardsman, bareheaded now, rain streaming down a face that the whole morning's mockery had not touched, and she said, loud enough that even over the storm the nearest cameras caught it, the thing her granddaughter had told her at the rope. "It's you, it's really you. You're the one who brought them down, you're Wren of the Callaway Ridge." And I watched the words land on the soaked, scattered, sobering crowd, and I watched the ones who knew what those words meant go very still, and I understood that the morning had finally, fully turned. Because there were people in that forecourt who knew the name. Of course there were. It had been in the papers for a week years ago, before the medals, before the line, before any of them had ever seen Aldous Wren stand a post in a tall black hat. The Callaway Ridge. A school party and 2 teachers, 16 souls, caught above the tree line when a storm came in faster than the forecast. A real storm, not a printed one. And the daylight gone and the temperature falling through the floor. Exactly the floor that Brock Vane had bragged about all morning as if he were the only man alive who'd stood on it. 16 people, and the rescue called off at dusk because no one could be sent up into that, and one man who had been coming down off the ridge on his own when the call went out, and who had turned around and gone back up into the dark instead of down out of it. One man who found them by reading a mountain the way other men read a street sign. One man who did not leave the weak ones and did not kill the party being a hero, but built the shelter and held all 16 of them through a night that the inquiry afterward said no one should have survived, and brought every last one of them down alive at first light. Slow, together, all of them breathing. That was the metal Brock Vane had flicked with his fingernail. That was the man he had spent the morning calling soft, decorative, a souvenir, a pretty thing that had never been cold. The girl in the red coat had recognized him from a photograph in her father's book, because her father, I would learn within the hour, had been one of the 2 teachers on the Callaway Ridge, one of the 16 Wren carried down, a man who would not have lived to have a daughter at all if the soft man in the tall hat had been the kind of man Brock Vane was so sure he was. The rain began to ease. It does that. The violent fronts pass as fast as they arrive, the very thing Aldous's eyes had told him an hour before. And in the strange, dripping quiet that followed, with the wreckage of Vane's segment strewn across the cobbles and the storm rolling off west over the roofs. The whole forecourt stood looking at one kneeling, bare-headed, soaked guardsman, and at the broad-tanned man in the expensive coat who stood 12 feet away with his hands still half raised, his camera still rolling, and nothing left at all behind his perfect teeth. Brock Vane had asked, on camera, on 6 continents, what a man like that gets a medal for. He had just watched the answer happen in front of him, and so had everyone else. The gray-suit liaison crossed the wet cobbles at an unhurried walk, and when he reached the wreckage, he did not look at Brock Vane at all. He knelt, a man of 55 or so, in a soaked good suit, kneeling on the stones without a thought for the cloth beside Aldous, and he put a hand on his shoulder, and he said something low that I was close enough to hear. "Still reading the East, then, Sergeant?" It was not a question. There was a whole shared history folded into the word sergeant, and into the small, tired smile that answered it. Then the liaison stood and turned and became somebody else entirely, became the man whose desk that television permission had crossed. He was not a liaison. He was the one who had signed the segment, read the featured guardsman's name, and come down himself to watch, because he had been on the search command the night of the Callaway Ridge, and had spent 15 years grateful to the man who'd gone up when he'd had to call everyone else back. He had let the morning run because he had trusted, with the certainty of a man who knew exactly who Aldous Wren was, that there was nothing Brock Vane could do to that guardsman that the guardsman could not stand. He had only been wrong about how the standing would end, not in the segment, but in the storm. "Mr. Vane," he said, and his voice had changed, all the mildness gone out of it and something quiet and final left in its place. "You came to my forecourt to teach my men what cold is. You spent an hour on a microphone explaining to 6 continents that this man, he did not point, he didn't need to, had never made a hard call, never been responsible for a life, never been cold a day in his life, and would fold the moment the world got unkind. You flicked his medal and asked what it was for." He let the rain fill the silence for a moment. "It is for the Callaway Ridge, 16 people, one night. He went up when I personally ordered the search stood down because I would not send another soul into that. He went up alone and he brought every one of them home. There is a teacher alive today because of it whose daughter you just watched him pull out from under your lighting rig, the rig your crew did not secure, in the weather you were warned about, that this man read off an empty sky an hour before it broke." He inclined his head very slightly, the smallest possible measure of contempt a disciplined man permits himself. "You asked what he gets a medal for, Mr. Vane. The answer is, for being the precise opposite of everything you told the world he was. And your own camera filmed the proof." Brock Vane did not say anything. There was, in fairness, nothing for him to say that the footage on 100 phones and his own running camera had not already said better than he ever could. He looked at the kneeling guardsman, and he looked at the child being wrapped in her grandmother's coat, and he looked at his own raised hands, which had frozen when it mattered, and I watched the whole expensive architecture of the man come down as quietly and as completely as his printed mountain had. Delamotte lowered her camera. She would tell me later, when the crews were packing the broken rig into the van, that in 19 years of television she had never once turned a camera off during a usable shot, and that she turned it off then because some things should not be filmed for the watching of strangers, and a man's face in the moment he understands what he has actually done is one of them. I have thought about that. I think it was the most decent thing anyone in that crew did all morning, and I think she knew it. The segment never aired. Of course it never aired. But the storm footage did somebody's phone, then everybody's. The soaked guardsman rising out of the wreckage with the child against his chest, the grandmother's words riding over the wind. "You're the one who brought them down. You're Wren of the Callaway Ridge." The world that Brock Vane had spent the morning trying to impress watched that instead, watched it millions of times, and the world drew its own conclusions about which man in that forecourt was soft, and which one was made of something the weather could not touch. The Survive Anything brand did not survive it. I am told he no longer does the show. I do not take pleasure in that. The line does not teach you to take pleasure in a man's ruin. It teaches you something harder and quieter, that the consequence when it comes should be allowed to be enough, and that the man who held his stillness through the mockery has no need to gloat over the man who could not hold his nerve through the storm. Aldous never said one word about Brock Vane. Not that day. Not since. When I asked him, weeks later, what he had been thinking through all that talk of beetles and frozen statistics, he was quiet for a while, and then he said the only thing he ever said about it. He wasn't wrong that the mountain doesn't care how brave you are. He was only wrong about which of us had met the mountain. And then he checked his chin strap and faced front, and that was the end of it. They gave the girl in the red coat a dry blanket and a hot drink, and before her grandmother took her home she slipped under the rope. A steward let her, just that once, and walked up to Aldous, who had retrieved his bearskin and his rifle and gone back, soaked through, to his post on the line as if the morning had asked nothing of him at all. She could not reach his face, so she did the thing children do. She reached up and took hold of one white glove, the way the lost ones always seem to know to do, and she held it for a moment and she said, "Thank you for coming up the mountain for my dad." And Aldous Wren, who had not moved for a tourist's spit or a host's mockery or a flicked medal in 11 years on that line, looked down at the small hand around his glove, broke his stare for her, only for her, and gave it the smallest possible squeeze. Then he faced front again, and the girl ran back to her grandmother, and the forecourt slowly emptied of its wet and chastened crowd, and the sun came back the way it does after a fast front passes, and the cobbles steamed. I stood my post beside him for the rest of that watch, 4 paces down the line, carrying my own face the way the line requires. And I thought about all the mornings I had heard the guard called soft by tourists, by drunks, by loud men who mistake stillness for weakness because they have never once had to hold themselves still against anything worth being afraid of. They look at a man who does not move and they think there is nothing inside the uniform but a wound-up toy. They are wrong, and Brock Vane learned how wrong on 6 continents and his own camera. The stillness is not the absence of the storm. The stillness is the discipline of a man who has already walked into the worst storm there is, and gone up when others were called back, and held 16 frightened souls through a dark that should have killed them all, and brought every one of them down alive at first light. A man like that does not need to flinch at a microphone. He has nothing left to prove to anyone who would mistake his calm for cowardice. He met the mountain. He carried them down. And then he came home and stood a quiet post by a gate where the loud men of the world could call him soft to his face, and never once guessed that the softest-looking man on the line was the only one among them who had ever truly been cold and held.